Hey guys, my name is Josh, and today I wanted to redo my testimony to coming to Jesus. So I'll kind of go over my entire backstory and what happened. So I started off with my father being a pastor and my family being a part of the Seventh day Adventist Church. We went there quite often, and after some time, I probably would have been like 6, 7, 8 years old at this point. My father, who had gone to seminary, had a degree, let's just say, started having theological disagreements with the Seventh day Adventist, which, if you know anything about Seventh day Adventism, is it's very culty in its theology, and it's much of it is based around the teachings of Ellen White and not so much of Jesus. So there's a lot more legalism involved. But being like 7, 8 years old, I had no concept of any of this. I just thought it was church. So long story short, my father ended up disbanding and being fired from that. And so he kind of lost his pastor job from there and hasn't since. But, time went on a little more. And about my 12th birthday, I think it was either my 12th or 13th, maybe it was my dad's birthday when I was 12 or 13, I made the choice to give my life to Christ. Even though I was only like 12 or 13 at the time, it just seemed like the right thing to do. It wasn't just something that, it wasn't because I was religiously indoctrinated. It wasn't just because, I was told that's what I was supposed to do. I made that conscious choice because, well, I had grown up around it. I had that environment around me. And I know I just felt, even at 12, 13 years old, I felt like deep down in my spirit, it's a choice that I wanted to make. But I didn't fully understand the ramifications of what it meant to give your life to Christ, like serving Him and doing those things. So, moving forward, so after that happened, the rest of my teenage years were pretty much just like any other normal kids. I didn't have anything traumatic happen. I didn't go through anything crazy. I pretty much just lived for me. Even though I went to church sometimes, that's all it really was to me. It was just church. I'd go there. I'd kind of be sick and tired to listen to worship music. It wasn't my gig. I thought it was really lame. Never felt it. And even the sermons, I was just like, whatever. Like, I knew God, but that was about it. I just knew of Him. And that was about the extent of my godliness, I guess, if you want to call it. I wasn't living righteous. I didn't make any decisions to live for God, even though I knew of Him and I knew of Jesus. But I think at that point in my life, I wore the title as Christian, even though there's nothing about my life that was Christian other than the pure fact of just believing God and who He was. That's really about it. It's the only thing I did that lived for Him, but yet I would stand and defend Christian values, so it was very hypocritical. So fast forward to about senior year of high school, and I'm about 18, about to be 19 at this point, and I ended up getting involved with this girl who brought me down a very toxic path at the time. I ended up losing my virginity at the time, which before I held on to that pretty securely. Like, I really wanted to save that for marriage, and I ended up sacrificing that over this short-term tumultuous relationship that did a lot of emotional damage to me. And I feel like that was one of the domino effects that would kind of destroy me going into my early 20s. So after that happened, I definitely feel like I kind of lost my way for the next couple years, but the next year following especially. So going from that is when I really started to, after I had sex, and I really started to really kind of just compromise my values. Now all of a sudden, I had a lot of interest in experimenting with drugs, mushrooms, weed, alcohol, but not so much. Like, I liked alcohol at the time, but I was never a huge drinker, and I'm very thankful for that because I see the damage that does trying to get off that, and I'm glad that it wasn't a thing I had to deal with. So, but I was a partier. I really kind of, going from about 18, 19, 20, I really stepped into that experimental party phase. So this would be summer of 2009. So I started talking to a lot of girls. Fortunately, I didn't end up really doing anything with a lot of these girls that I was talking to, which is a blessing. because I would have destroyed myself further. But a lot of conversations were had. I didn't try to hook up with anybody, but I tried to start relationships. Nothing really worked. Come December of 2009, trying to make sure I'm not fast forwarding anything. So back in the summer of 2009 is when I started experimenting with drugs, just psychedelics and like weed. But that still kind of started taking me down a path that would lead further into the next chapter. So ended up going through several different relationships, doing more things, compromising my values and self. Not necessarily having sex, but doing things I definitely should not be doing with these girls. And that kind of puts us in about 2010. From 2010 up until summer, I start to get heavily involved in playing music live. Not music live, excuse me, just music in general. And the whole life that came with it, even though we weren't touring or anything, a lot of partying, more drugs, more weed smoking, psychedelics, being around girls like that. And that is where I ended up. This doesn't have anything to correlate with the music. It just happened to happen at the same time, is that I got involved with this girl who is now my ex-wife and the daughter of my oldest. We became a thing, which lasted for almost 4.5 years, but I'll get to that in a minute. So we lasted, but that was a very tumultuous, doomed relationship from the start. Very, very toxic. Very toxic. And we kind of fed off each other's negativity. Like I said, there's a lot of drug use going on. Okay, well, long story short, 2010 comes, about end of June. The guy I was playing drums with, well, he gets evicted, so that kind of just dissipates altogether. Like, it kind of just stops. And the girl that I was dating at the time, she didn't really have anywhere else to go. So, long story short, she ends up coming to live with me, which I look back, I don't know how my parents allowed this, but they did. She comes to live with me, and it becomes a very toxic situation very quick, to where it starts affecting other people in the house. At the time, my brother was living with us. Our rooms were right next to each other, so he could hear everything that goes on. So he started hearing stuff, and it was pretty bad. It was pretty bad. And get to about November, it was like right after Thanksgiving of like 2010. We'd still been like smoking a bunch of weed, and just the toxicity was really bad. She ended up getting kicked out. Long story short, she ended up moving up north and did this little homeless stint for a while, and I would go up and meet up with her. So she ended up getting pregnant with my oldest daughter at the time. And the entire time that she was pregnant, it was all over the place. Like, she went from staying at several people's houses to getting kicked out, to coming living in my closet for a while, to getting kicked out. Or she'd be not getting kicked out, but to move into another person's place. It was like 3 or 4 different places back and forth. I'm not going to divulge in every detail because it would just take too long, but long story short, it was a very toxic time. My parents were still very anti this girl because of like just how toxic she was and what she did to me and how she was affecting me. And now I was having a baby with her, and she didn't have a good living situation because she was so back and forth. It was just not a good time. But anyway, she ends up moving into this friend's trailer, like kind of out in the middle of nowhere. And I ended up moving in with her around the end of August, beginning of September, right where my daughter was born. And it was at this time where I had left home for like 3-4 weeks. I'd moved in there, but then we ended up moving back in after 3 or 4 weeks because that was a bad situation too. Like, we didn't have properly running water, and it was bad. So we ended up coming back here to, where my parents were, because I didn't really have a job at the time. So my daughter was just born, and we ended up staying there for 3-4 years. And so this is where things really started to turn bad. So this would have been fall of 2011, September, October. So, and then we would remain there or at least she would, till fall of 2014. So during that 3 years that we were there at my parents' house, just living together, things grew increasingly worse. Even though we were in the midst of raising our daughter, her mental health just started to decline more than you could imagine, to the point to where I became her full-time caretaker, just because she couldn't manage living. Not suicidal, but just she couldn't function. And it caused a lot of tension and toxicity between her and my family, and her and me. On top of that, our daughter was diagnosed with autism, so she needed a lot of special care. So most of my time, in fact, from the ages of 21, 22 to about 25, I was just my daughter's primary caretaker, because that was my full-time thing. And we were living off the state. It was a very rough time. At the same time, I was pretty much being... this girl and I, we also ended up getting married. There was a small little ceremony thing. And so I was busy taking care of her mental, emotional needs, because she was so damaged and never got therapy for it. So I would be doing that on the same time taking care of my daughter, and that was my full plate. Well, things just rapidly progressed and got more and more, I don't want to say violent, even though there was physical violence that had happened in the relationship, like physically attacking each other, beating each other, among all the other verbal abuse that happened. She ended up leaving early October of 2014. So this vicious cycle just continued. Come to about like March, April of 2014, about 6 months before she left, she like lost her mind. Like she ended up shaving her head and going through this huge emotional like thing. Her and I both ended up gaining a lot of weight. Just drown ourselves in smoking weed and eating a lot of bad food. I was at my heaviest weight then. The summer was kind of doing, the same thing. And then as we led into the fall is when that changed and she left. So not long after that, I met my current wife, who I have 2 other children with. So then that would lead into the next few years of my life, so like 2015. Again, this whole time I knew who Jesus was, I knew who God was, but I was not living for Christ at all. And I'm putting these backstory pieces in so you can kind of fully understand the big picture, which again, I get to that. And if you're sticking with me for this long, well, thank you. So come 2015, 2016, I've now met my current wife. We were just dating at the time. She's a Christian too. Unlike the last wife I had, she was not a Christian at all. I think she was agnostic and pagan. So that tells you a lot right there, how good of a mix that was. We ended up getting married March of 2016, and she wouldn't get pregnant with my son until 6 months later, in September, October. But we were financially struggling for a little while. We ended up living at my parents' house, and then we ended up moving out in May of 2017. Okay, I'm not going to give you every single detail of my life. It's not important. I'm just trying to move things along so you understand my testimony. So things have been, from the time I was 18, 19, started experimenting with drugs, like I had said, up until now, you can kind of grasp the big picture of how things have progressively gotten worse. So over this time, I've taken physical, emotional, and mental abuse. That just gets stored in my psyche. I've done more drugs to fill the void and numb myself. I've destroyed my body with really bad food, and I'm at my heaviest. My attitude, my outlook on myself and other people was uglier than it's been. Just a lot of bad things. And I struggle with addiction because I was around cannabis so much that it became ultimately addiction, that I needed it all the time to cope. And I would sneak it, and I would manipulate and lie in any way I could to have that fix. This is where things really began to pick up. So we moved in here, where we currently are at, in May of 2017. I didn't have a job at the time, but my wife, her friend's mom, was the manager at this pot shop about 30 minutes from here. And she managed 2 of them. She worked for a small company who oversaw all the stores. I think there's like 11 in total. I won't mention the name of the stores. But this is Washington State, so it is legal. She ran both stores. There's one here in town, which is about 15 minutes that way. And then the one that she worked at, or the main one that I ended up getting hired at, was down that way, completely different direction. So, long story short, she hears I need a job. You know, you can see where this is going. So I ended up getting the job. I worked there basically selling it. And in that time, I ended up, because if you ever work at a pot shop, you end up getting a lot of free samples, is what they call it. So to try product and stuff. So I ended up, an addict basically gets access to an unlimited supply at their fingertips of just all sorts of stuff they can try constantly. And you kind of, the job requires you to be smoking, so you have to be trying stuff. And on top of that, you're making like 20-30 bucks in tips a night, and I would be buying weed with that. Not to mention the free weed you're getting. You're hooking up with people who are selling it, like vendors, so sometimes they'll slip you stuff under the table. It's just, it got crazy. So fast forward another year, and it brings us to 2018. I'd been working there for a year at this point. Everybody who I worked with ended up getting fired or leaving, and the boss whom I was working for, I don't know if she had health issues or something, but she ended up stepping down. I was the only person at the store left. So if I quit, there would be nobody to run the store. And because of that, I ended up taking my role as manager for the following year. So during that time would be the time that it became even crazier. So since I now had full control of the store, and I got even more product, which basically fed my addiction more. And during this time, I was going through severe spiritual attacks. I was depressed. I wanted to kill myself. I was suicidal. Not that I actually ever attempted it, but I would want to do those things. I would want to take out my life, and I did a lot of reckless things, a lot. And this time period specifically, the reason why I'm mentioning this, and the reason why I mentioned my past, is to bring up to this point, or at least as a point, because 2018 into 2019 was definitely one of the most tumultuous, toxic internal points. I was going through some really bad stuff internally. I hated myself. I hated other people. I hated everybody. The only way I could feel peace was being high all the time. Sorry about that. The video decided to cut off. So I was working around a bunch of people that I wouldn't say were addicts, but they also ingested it all the time. They smoked it all the time. So we were around each other all the time. So that's what we did, and it just fed into that lifestyle even more. And working that job, you're constantly getting more and more. So imagine being an alcoholic and you're in an environment where you're getting free alcohol every few days. You're around people who are drinking all the time. It wears on you, and it ultimately feeds your addiction. And if you weren't an alcoholic in that environment, you would become one just because of what you're around and the fact that you're getting it so much. And that's kind of what happened to me. I had already dealt with addiction to that, so it was just feeding that even more. So in 2019, I ended up getting laid off end of June, and at this time I ended up pursuing YouTube full time. And so even though I had gotten laid off from the job, I still had tons of product left over because I got more than I could ever smoke. So I was still dealing with addiction at this time. And, again, everything that I'm talking about is just building upon what was already done and building to, we're about to get to the final point here. So if you've stayed with me this long, well, I wanted to build my backstory up for a reason. So I'm doing YouTube full time, but I'm still dealing with addiction because, again, I have all this product still that I'm using daily, multiple times every day, manipulating, lying, stealing, anything I can to keep the addiction fed and make myself numb, because my heart just continued to grow darker and blacker. And I was in such a state of self-despair. I hated myself. Like I said, I hated everybody, but these feelings just became stronger. I began to hate anyone who, I don't want to say anybody who was a Christian per se, but I think I just wanted to lash out at anybody else that was happy, because I was in so much mental and emotional pain. And if you're watching this and you've dealt with any of that in your life, then you know how that is, where you can hide it pretty well. And you could fake being happy in fake social situations, where nobody will ever know. And I did it pretty well. Because I didn't want people to know. It's embarrassing. And it's, for somebody to know that and for you to open up, it puts you in a very vulnerable position. So, and also during this time too, over the course of my wife and I's entire relationship, things have just become more and more toxic, and not physically violent, but, very verbally bad, toxic again. A lot of it was just issues in the relationship. A lot of it was brought on by me. But anyway, things continue to get worse gradually. Just overall, my life, everything. Internally, my addiction, my relationship, everything just slowly kind of kept getting worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. We move into 2020 and fast forward up to about June. Now, before I move on from this, at this point, things have already gotten really bad. I think I had made some self-attempts to hurt myself, and my heart was the blackest it's ever been, and I was in a really dark chapter. If you had met me at the time, you would have no idea, because again, I hid it pretty well, but internally, I was suffering. I was tormented. I was in emotional agony. I felt like I would be better. I'd really, really wanted to kill myself. I just felt like I'd be better off. I'd be doing a favor to everybody around me to do it. And so I was really contemplating it. Not really like, oh, I'm going to do it and here's how I'm going to do it and when. But it just, I'd really, really been stewing on the idea of it. And again, not necessarily thinking of acting on it, but just, I was more suicidal than I'd ever been. And it's mercy that saved me. It's the fact that God came in and shook my spirit and saved me when he did. It's a miracle, because had he not, it's very possible that I would have ended up taking my own life. Who knows how many more months down the road, because things were heading in that direction had they progressed. I don't know how much more time was needed for that to even get to that point, but had they kept progressing that way, I think that's what would have happened. And my heart was only getting more black by the day. So come to June, and out of nowhere, and this is the craziest thing. This is like a God thing. So much time we have. How are we doing on time? Okay. This is the godly thing right here, is that I'm literally sitting here one day, just normal, and I feel my spirit. I don't know what kind of experience you want to call it, but I felt God just right into me. And it shook me to my core. And I remember a voice, not like an audible voice you can hear, but it's hard to describe it. I heard a voice and he said, "Son, it's time." And I was filled with the Holy Spirit. Call it a religious experience, call it a hallucination. It was none of those things. It was very real. I'd felt God before several times in my life, long ago, back when I kind of just wasn't really serious about it, even though I had moments. But it was definitely God. Shot into my spirit and said, "Son, it's time." And I knew at that point I was in such a low that I had no excuse not to just give everything over. So I made that choice that day to just rededicate my life to him. And as soon as that happened, he just infiltrated my entire spirit, my body, and almost like overnight completely changed my heart. And he gave me a brand new heart and started immediately working on my life. And now all of a sudden, my suicidal thoughts, everything just kind of gone. My addiction, gone. And I had nothing more than a desire to all of a sudden serve him. And it wasn't about being religious. It wasn't getting into religion. This was a spiritual one-on-one connection with the Holy Spirit and Jesus. This was far more larger than any religion could be. This wasn't about that. I know some might try and write it off as that, or like, oh, you're religious now, or, oh, you had a religious experience, it's in your head. No, I'm telling you, I wasn't thinking about God. There was nothing that would have moved me to that. It was him. He awoke in my spirit. He didn't just awake my spirit, he ignited my spirit. And what to verify that is not just all of a sudden he did that. Now I'm like, oh, I'm a goody Christian. That's not what that's about. He ignited my spirit, and he said, son, there's not a lot of time, and we have a lot to do. And I wouldn't know exactly what he meant by that at the time, but what he was telling me, and I'm going to backtrack here for just a second. Back when I was a teenager, I had a calling on my life when I wasn't, even though I was a Christian, I wasn't a Christian, but I had a calling in my life that I would be a warrior. And I didn't know what that meant. I'm like, does that mean like a spiritual warrior? Like, not an actual warrior with like a sword and shield, like going out and killing people, but, in a spiritual sense, doing battle with the enemy. And I was always like, what does that mean? When is my calling? And as soon as he came into me and said, son, it's time, training starts now. Like, you need to start training. And so again, my spirit was like reignited. And now all of a sudden my eyes were all over the place, the world and this thing and this kind of suffering. And now, he brought me to him. Now I had this insatiable hunger in my spirit, in my heart, to just want to serve him. It wasn't about, oh, now I want to go to church. Now I want to be religious. Now I want to, only wear pants and not wear jewelry. And it wasn't about that. It's not about religion. I wanted to serve the Holy Spirit and have a relationship with Jesus and be connected to the Creator. That's the only way I know how to describe it. And when he comes into you, it's not about being religious. I wanted to serve him. And so I'm like, Lord, what can I do? And so now he's coming into me, and when you have the Holy Spirit in you, you could feel his presence in you. It's this amazing, it's better than any high, better than anything you can experience. It's just this extreme peace and joy. It's undescribable. And he just starts working in your life. You start sacrificing things for him and start saying, okay, God, I'm going to surrender myself to you. And because I want to grow closer to you and work on my walk with you. And now all of a sudden he starts putting people and things in your life to kind of help you grow. And, at the same time, you kind of got to start getting rid of the junk in your life and clean out your closet. And so there's wrongs that I had to go and make right. And I'm still working on some of those. There's things I had to get rid of that were holding me back. So I got rid of all my drugs, everything that I still had over, any paraphernalia, anything, it's all gone. That was mine. But this isn't necessarily any chronological order like the things I just mentioned. This has just been since my spirit has been reawakened. But after he reawoken me, he was like, son, to prove to you that this is me, he had led me to a couple different YouTube videos, and he told me that he'd wanted me to watch them. And he had also expressed to me before I watched these that this isn't just like, oh, well, God just randomly came into you. He's, the time and place we're in the world right now, things are turning, like we're getting ready to hit the end. The tribulation, what we're about getting ready to start the last bit of time. And so he's going through and he's awakening the spirits of many, many people who are, dwelled into Satanism, New Age, just about any other religion or walk of life you can imagine, and just shaking their spirit and awakening them. And he showed me some people who, by the way, who had like just made YouTube videos of their testimony, and the same thing too, that they've just been reawakened themselves. And he showed a few of these people to me. There's one particular I can remember, and it was a young girl who was saved from like the New Age movement and just the complete Luciferian agenda that was like wrapped in that. And kind of the same thing too, like these aren't people who are just like, oh, well, I'm thinking about God, I'm going to go to church and go get saved. This is not that. This is just, you're doing your own thing, and God grabs you and pulls you from that and awakes you. There's no other way to describe it. This wasn't a brought on thing. And so I'm watching this girl, and I'm just like, wow, Lord, this is you. This is incredible. And, through that, now I start, my discipleship. Now I start my walk, my true walk that I never had in my entire life. And now I'm walking as a spiritual warrior to learn the word, which, again, even though I knew bits and pieces of Bible here and there, I never sat down and tried to learn the Bible or study the word. But now I am I establish myself in a good church that I'm going to, and just have a hunger to go because, I want to be filled. I want my spirit to be filled, making connections with other people like pastors and people who can help guide you to where you go. And if you're not a believer and you're watching this isn't about getting bound up in religion or legalism. Legalism being like rules and regulations you got to follow or you're going to go to hell or this. This is just strictly about having a one-on-one connection with Jesus and having this amazing relationship. Now, that doesn't mean you're not going to struggle. It doesn't mean you're not going to be perfect because it's not about being perfect. This doesn't mean that you're all of a sudden going to be a Jesus freak, and all of a sudden, life is going to go perfect, because you're going to have even more trials and tribulations against your life. And I have. Since I gave my life to him, gave my life seriously for him, I've had a lot of trials and tribulations. There's points a few months ago where I was pulled away and I got distracted and I kind of fell off the bandwagon. I guess you'd call it. I backslid for a little while, for about a couple months. And I was really struggling to get back on, and I was kind of really feeling a lot of despair about it. Because I just, God was calling me to do certain things, and I could not do it. Like, I just could not to bring myself to do it. But I moved past it, and I'm closer with God than I've ever been in my life at this point in time right now. So if you're still watching to this point, that's kind of the grand moment of my testimony, is I literally went from a sickened, addicted, suicidal, depressed, self-hating, everyone else hating, selfish, narcissistic, sociopathic, damaged, broken individual, and God just picked me up and just brushed me off, gave me a new heart, cleaned me up. And how could you not want to serve him after that? He's not making me. I can choose to walk away at any time, but you end up falling in love, and you just want to serve him and do everything you can. And so I'm on my path right now, and I'm doing it. And so if you watch to this point and you're not really feeling sure about that, all I ask is that you just spend time in prayer, spend time in the Word, study, watch sermons online. That was a huge thing that really helped me too. Watch a bunch of sermons and just feed your spirit in any way you can, because you could either feed your spirit and self with everything else around you, the world, making money, hobbies, or you can fill your soul and spirit with something that's really going to matter, which is your eternity. And you're only going to spend it in either one or two places, so you got to determine what's important. And if you don't believe it, you don't believe it. But I would hate to be wrong and then wake up after you die and realize you were wrong, because at that point it's done. So I hope this testimony has helped encourage you wherever you are, and I hope it at least make you think. So that's about it for my really long testimony. I appreciate you for listening and sticking through this far, and so you can go and catch more of my videos on this channel. I'll see you later.